Cadence Debuse. This is Busybody Podcast, and today I'm speaking with Susanna Crossman to discuss her book, Home is Where We Start. I'm so thrilled that she agreed to be on the podcast because I basically inhaled this book, and I think it really touches on a lot of things that we discuss regularly on this podcast, maybe even in a little bit more of a metaphorical sense of finding our bodies in space and time. So I hope you enjoyed this interview and conversation. I totally found your book just by chance because I read The Guardian and they did a little excerpt and then I ordered it.
Yeah.
And really just like flew through it. Is there anything I can answer for you before we like actually get started?
No, I don't think so. I was just listening to the Chelsea Hotel one, which I loved.
I know. I would love for you guys to meet sometime. She actually was just in Paris the other day doing an event. She's so cool, and yeah, there are a lot of parallels.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I'm meeting Moon Zappa next week for tea, and we've got lots of parallels as well.
I bet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, do you want to introduce kind of the main premise, just like you said, so that there's no specifics about where you grew up and all that?
So Home is Where We Start is the story of how in the 70s, late 70s, I went with my mother and siblings to this crumbling mansion in the middle of the English countryside. And we'd been attending all these meetings before with this group of people who wanted to set up a commune. And so we went from a kind of British suburban traditional setting into this extraordinary world, which right from the beginning felt like a fairy tale, really. The huge mansion, outbuildings, woods, acres of land, ornamental gardens, 60 rooms, and with 50 adults and children trying to remake the world. And Home is Where We Start is the story of the 15 years I lived in that commune, and then interwoven with an adult voice commenting on my views and the different aspects of it today that I then examine.
That is really what I found so unique about the book, was that you go back and forth in time. And not only is it your adult perspective on your own childhood, which a lot of memoir has, but you're a mental health professional and literally work with children and families from what I can tell. And so you actually have expertise looking back on what your experience was. So I feel like we need to also set the stage a little bit more. It was very bucolic. It was also very traumatic, and there was a real intention to kind of disperse the family structure, which must have been very kind of shocking. It seemed very shocking to you as a child, and very like disembodying in some ways, to have no adult that you really felt you could go to. It's so interesting because, like you said, it is also this fairy tale. There are times where it's like everyone's dream. It's like reading Huck Finn or Secret Garden or something, these books that when we were little were like, oh my God, the adventure that I could be on as a child that basically has no guidance. And you really are having these adventures, and there is a real wholesomeness to it at times. And then in other places, there's just a terrible sense of abandonment, really, of loneliness, of loss, that also as a child it felt like, understandably, you didn't have really a way to articulate because it was just what your experience was.
So yeah, it was the idea at that time. So it was very strongly influenced, the commune, by socialist experiments, by feminism, and one of the big things, like you mentioned, was exploding the nuclear family. So like lots of utopias, and it's fascinating if you look back in history at Brook Farm, all those different kind of utopian models, they all have this same kind of structure. You withdraw from society, you recreate the family and domestic life and relationships, you chuck in a bit of back to nature, some theory, something a bit esoteric. And so when we arrived, it really was this fairy tale. And then very quickly, as you say, we were structured into 2 social groups. So I wasn't allowed to call my mum mummy, which was what British kids at that time called them.
Yeah.
And that was almost seen as really humiliating and a sign of weakness if you needed a parent. And we were very much left as this gang to fend for ourselves. And very quickly, that kind of fairy tale, these kind of shadows entered. It was incredibly rough. You couldn't ask if you fell over. That was seen as weak to ask for help. Any kind of bullying that was happening within the group of children, we were just left to sort it out by ourselves. And we weren't equipped emotionally to deal with those things. And so, as you say, the kind of traumatic elements came in very, very quickly. And also, when we then left the commune, because we were living in quite a marginal setup, we had private living spaces that were called units, but other than that, everything happened collectively. Then we went into school. And then this idea of privilege that we were being told in the commune, that we were these incredibly privileged children, that we were this radical life, suddenly you hit the reality of school, which was that we were dirty, we were sharing most of our clothes, we weren't speaking the same language as people at school. So very quickly, again, that became this kind of environment where you had to survive. And that whole notion of survival, I think, was just... I lived in that commune 15 years, and I think most of the time what I learned how to do was to survive. Mm-hmm. And as you say, as a mental health professional now, when I was writing the book, I really drew upon Winnicott, who talks a lot about children who are in those types of situations and create these, what he calls a false self, which is where you're basically being a kind of people pleaser, trying to adapt constantly. And I think that was a huge take.
I did find that aspect of the kind of the dichotomy that you really articulated so beautifully in the book, of this like home life that was so unique and so specific. And then you get dropped off at school, which is so British, like suburban, like the little village, and the mom's all dressed up. And I just was really stunned by that, like that experience for you, and how you had to navigate that also completely alone, and with 2 sets of adults, kind of the school set of adults and the home set of adults, telling you 2 different stories about your life, every day, every week. Can you also just kind of explain for people, the commune existed out of a need? That's what I really got from this. That
it existed out of
a need that just culturally at that time, especially from your mother's perspective. After her divorce.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I did, when I was writing the book, I wanted it, as well as having these 2 voices. So there's a child's voice and an adult voice. I went to the British Library and I did a lot of archive research. And what's really important, I think, is we were a single parent family. We'd undergone a traumatic story where my sister had died in a freak accident. My dad had then left my mum. There was 3 of us. And women were in such economic instability at that time. It was very difficult for women to get a mortgage. It was very difficult. I remember my mum, when we were young children, going to, for example, a parents' meeting and being the only mother who wore trousers. It's a very, very different world. Most women hadn't worked much. They'd given up their careers to look after children if they had worked. And so economically, communes therefore provided this whole kind of way to, a bit like now that people are looking at new models, which was one of the things that, really was a strong push for me to write the book. To share childcare, to kind of reinvent domestic structures. And so that's where that whole kind of wave of feminism and socialism kind of fed in to that.
That was what I found really interesting from your perspective, looking at it as an adult, and then obviously us reading it as an adult. There were times where I really, as I said, I had bizarrely, when I emailed you, there were so many places of parallel and resonance to my own childhood, even though I did not at all grow up in an environment, well, in an intentional environment like that. There were a lot of aspects that were a very similar environment. And yet, because yours was intentional, I had a lot of empathy for your mother as an adult, as right now, me being an adult woman, thinking that really gave her a lot of access. It gave her a lot of support. I could totally see her drive to go there. And also, I wonder, she must have had some pretty exciting experiences there, even just her freedom. You know, you talk about her various boyfriends that she had, and I'm kind of like, wow, go her. She's like... You know, she was living her adult life probably in a way that she had never been able to before, and does in a lot of ways kind of abandon you and your siblings, which also there's a part of me that's like, well, yeah, I mean, she probably just got pushed into having children because that's what everyone did, and now she's realizing, oh, I'm this young adult, like I really have a whole life, and here my kids are getting fed, they have a roof over their head, they're fine, they're running around, I'm basically going to just live my life. And I can totally really empathize with that and kind of cheer for her. And at the same time, also being a person who has been a child, I am just like so like in grief and like horrified at times, and how often she's just completely unavailable and also really just misses you, particularly the moment where she just informs you that you're not going to go to the, what I guess for us would be high school that you wanted to go to. That was such a moment of what I felt like betrayal, just terrible betrayal as a mother, to not see how important that was to you, to not see your talents, to not see that obviously that was where you would want to be and where you would be happiest, and just to completely put her values on you without any discussion. That was such a heartbreaking moment.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you felt that, because I didn't want, it's very much a book that's written from a place of compassion. I didn't want to finger point at my mum or at my dad or the other adults that I grew up with. And yet, you know, simultaneously, I think there was a huge amount of courage to go to these places. I think what I find quite frightening and similarly quite interesting is how gradually, and it's something Hannah Arendt writes about, the ideology that they're all developing in this very free way of living and this, you know, really exciting, very innovative, very brave, kind of adventurous experiment suddenly becomes less and less of a safe place to live in for the children, and that itself is actually ignored, and that the reality, Arendt says that the when we separate experience from theory is when we get kind of tyrannical forms of living and politics, is when we're not kind of really looking every day at what's happening in terms of what our intentions are and what the impact is. And I think there's this huge gap in our childhood between what the intentions were and what the impact was. And yet, like you say, I think it is really important to point out. And I think one of the things that's been incredibly interesting, actually, a lot of the events of the books is that they really have been intergenerational. So I've had a lot of readers who are in, you know, between, 25 and 40 and want to go and live in a commune. And so they come because they want to kind of go, you know, what could go wrong? And then there's people of kind of more Generation X, sort of, so, you know, born in the 70s, who are then, you know, I think a lot of children in the 70s had lived through forms of parentification where we were either looking after our parents a bit or just massively having to deal with stuff on our own, because it was just a completely different era. Baby boomers didn't parent. I've got 3 children. they didn't parent like we parent today. There was just this whole thing of where you just got on with it. Mm-hmm. You know, you just got on with it. And then there's obviously extremes. My version is extreme.
Yeah.
It's, and also what's fascinating when you look at that period is there were even sociologists saying loving children is out of fashion. You should not express. There's this guy, Barrington, I've got his name, Barrington, a sociologist, and he actually says, you know, we shouldn't be giving affection to our children.
Sorry.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And then you've got this whole, what influenced our commune as well was this very strong socialist ethic, which you also find in Kundera's writing when he writes about the experience of communism in the Eastern Bloc, which is just, we're all the same, we all just have to get on with it, don't fuss about your petty bourgeois self. You know, and again, it's another form of kind of, you know, theory which justifies this very dehumanizing. And that's why in the book I write a lot about an institutional childhood, because it's very dehumanizing in a kind of physical and psychological way. There was very much a notion of being part of a pack in a really strong way.
That's really fascinating because from the outside, because it is so literally bucolic and it does have this kind of, you know, like bohemian Downton Abbey, like hippie Downton Abbey vibe.
Yeah.
That I think really just resonated with me so much in my own experiences, to recognize that something from the outside that looks really free and creative and wild is actually can be as dark as a public school, like a British style public school where people are separated from their parents from a very young age and, you know, all sleep in dormitory beds and all these things that you just would not think have any similarities, but actually do, and have a lot of the same trauma and a lot of the same force children to have a lot of the same experiences. That was just like endlessly fascinating to me over and over again. You guys are doing things that on the outside, you know, making sandwiches from this incredible bread that's getting made in the house every day and dipping into the giant vat of peanut butter, these really like hippie hallmarks that make people think of something that's really wholesome and very family oriented and very like close to nature and nurturing. And at the same time, there's you have no privacy, there's no sense of connection anywhere. There's just this constant, like, you guys are just bouncing around like electrons, like trying to find, you know, children need an anchor point. Anything that's growing needs an anchor point.
I know, and that's how I ended up, I think, because like with any memoir, you're kind of looking like what's the thread, like what's going to kind of pull all of these kind of strands together. And that's where the title came, as Home is Where We Start, because it was really to kind of question within all of that what specifically was kind of lacking. And like you say, that sense of intimacy, that sense of safety, that comfort, that place where you can just be and you're not surviving, but you're being, I think was just hugely lacking. And when you talk about the institutional things, it was fascinating. I was in Edinburgh last week doing an event, and a woman came up to me and she said, do you think that, like she said, in Edinburgh, there are all of these beautiful architectural, you know, these amazing buildings, and they house private schools. And I went to one of them. And do you think it's exactly what you're saying? She said, do you think that there's this beautiful facade is hiding this neglect of like, of what happened to me? And I was like, yeah, I do. I think it's a form of, and it was so, it's really extraordinary. Just, yeah, people who've had military backgrounds have contacted me as well. And yeah, those, because what's interesting about the people as well, I think, you know, it's probably the same in the States, who are setting up those experiments in the 70s. There's a lot of them have experience boarding. I mean, in Britain, America's slightly different, but in Britain, a lot of them have experienced those boarding schools. So they are repeating it as well. They're repeating their own pattern of, you know, which is why I also describe in the book these very sort of almost jolly moments where we celebrate Christmas, and suddenly in this Marxist feminist house, oh, we all sing, you know, Hark the Herald Angels King. Kind of like, and so, yeah, it's that whole institutional side, I think, and because I work in institutions, it's something I work in mainly psychiatric hospitals, but I also work in oncology and I work in hospitals all over France. And yeah, just seeing, it's meant I've studied a lot institutions and how they function or can dysfunction. And there were so many elements, and particularly the idea of an institution which closes its doors. I think that's when they go into a danger zone. Once you're withdrawing from society and you're closing your doors, any type of behaviour that in a way you might modify, because you might kind of walk out of your front door and kind of go, oh yeah, you bump into a neighbour, you have a chat, and then you're talking about how you do things differently, and you kind of think, maybe I'll do that differently with my kids, or maybe I'll decorate my house differently. I don't know, you're just constantly modifying, going from to and fro. And I think in a utopian model, you don't. And a lot of people stayed 24/7 in that house at the beginning. So they were just, you know, carrying on doing their same thing day after day, you know, watching the grass grow on the lawn or milking the cows, having meetings.
That is wild. Can you speak a bit about the lack of key? You have this whole thing about keys and doors and privacy, and how even now keys are kind of foreign to you. And that was a really interesting, just like fact, but also kind of a beautiful layer, kind of metaphor for a lot of things as well.
So I wanted to look at the whole thing about boundaries, and I also wanted to, because we were kind of reinventing the world, I wanted to look at really basic things like in the book, like how we use doors. And so we had this, so we were in all the ground floor, it was a 3-story house, all the ground floor was communal. The second floor and the third were divided into units, so people's private living space that could be like a few rooms or one room if they were single people. But nowhere at all was locked. The only place where you had to knock on the door was a darkroom for photographers. So that was the only place, because obviously people were developing photos. And so as a child, I had no notion of doors that you should or you shouldn't open. So I was quite curious. I've got I'm just kind of quite an adventurous spirit on that level. And so regularly I'd open doors on either people having screaming arguments or people having sex, or just finding yourself in the middle of someone else's domestic situation. And there's just this notion of this endless opening space, which has this kind of, is limitless. And what's really fascinating, if you look anthropologically at doors that we open, I think it's like 600 times a day you kind of open and close doors, is that they shut people out, but they also protect you. So there's this whole notion of how we've developed doors, and we have doors in different ways to kind of ritualize things, to see when people come in and out, and also to create the degrees of intimacy that we have with people. So the way you'll have with your closest family or friends, or the people who are your nearest and dearest, whatever your chosen family structure is, but you'll be having these degrees of separation. Whereas for us, everything was open. And I talk about that. And so I didn't have a key until I was like about 20. I didn't have a key at all. And I still, now I literally constantly shut doors. I constantly, and I was telling someone the other day, I've only once lived in an open space, living space, and I found it made me feel incredibly anxious, like a kind of, just like open
like
plan
living room.
and like a loft type thing. And I really find it, I really sort of need, I think, to just kind of shut things, even drawers, drawers.
Yeah.
I need to shut them. They're really something. It makes me feel really anxious in a room if there's like doors open to cupboards and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a little bit of a PTSD with doors, but yeah, it's I think it's really interesting to look at that whole notion of space and boundaries and how that affects child development, and the contrast between the fact that everything was open and then we were closed off to the outside world. I find that contrast totally fascinating.
Yeah. And I think, protection is just like a huge theme in the book, that there was no one protecting you. And then even the space wasn't protective. There, most children even have a little clubhouse or a room that's their own or whatever. And it never felt that you had that respite, except off in the woods, really. But that's more of like a hidden space. And that kind of this like what felt almost like this endless corridor with all these adults going in and out. There was such a sense of the adults functioning very much as their own group, and so almost faceless as well. Like there were these big players, but I don't know, I feel like I'm not articulating well, but almost this like the galaxy expanding. It's like everything is just sort of moving, and there is this like weird spaciousness that isn't freeing feeling at all. It's like there's all these people, there's all this stuff, there's all these rooms, there's all this place to explore, but there's no rest. There's just these brief moments every once in a while with your mother where you guys would kind of be in her room and basically like for 1 minute have real family unit or have a little ritual between you.
Yeah, that's so perceptive. I totally understand it's exactly that. It's like there's a bit in the book where I say it was like being in it's like being in the hall of a huge station, like Central Station. It's as though you're like living in Central Station, or you're or you're in an airport. And actually, I do love those places now. I feel I love being in transit. I find that very. I feel very at home when I'm in transit, and it was this sense of just constant movement and constant change and constant stimulation. And it's one of the things I've often said to my daughters. It was like being in the school playground but never going home, because there's that idea of this sort of like noise and stimulation. And obviously I had my own bedroom, but then the kids that I might be falling out with or who might be bullying me could just come into my room. It wasn't like if you're being bullied, you go home. Well, you know that when you're home, that can't happen. And similarly in the book, and I describe instances like sexual violence or physical violence or abuse. Those were also happening. So you were kind of dealing with something, and then it was inside your domestic space. So you weren't ever going home from it. You were always in it, and you were always there with it. And it was such a kind of constant of having to deal with it and not having this almost nest or shelter or place where you knew people couldn't get to you, and the fact, like you say, that the intimacy of people. So the fact that somebody would move in and then the next morning you'd be having breakfast with them.
Right.
So you'd be at the breakfast table with somebody, and that might go on for 6 months, 2 years, 10 years, and then boom, they'd be gone. And most of those people I never, ever, ever saw again. So in terms of like attachment theory and continuity, it's completely, yeah, it's very bewildering to think, how do you construct relationships afterwards? How do you learn about continuity? How do you learn about heritage? How do you learn about passing things on? And I was interested actually when I heard the interview you did with the woman who grew up in Chelsea Hotel, and you were talking about kind of that embodied memory and that sense of embodied memory of being so institutional. I mean, I'm going back again to the institution, but I think it's that kind of very sort of, I think it's quite dehumanizing, that when you don't have an intimate, safe place, like how you perceive the sort of value, I guess, of your own body and its need for kind of gentleness and care and softness. And I write in the book about discovering like being clean, getting clean as an adult, and now how it's a really, you know, it sounds odd, but I really kind of learnt to enjoy just sort of luxuriating, but like quite late in my life. To, you know, it wasn't something, I didn't really know that. My body didn't know kind of getting really clean regularly and being kind of having a parental figure or an adult who was a kind of constant parental figure who would like wrap me in a towel and, you know, put me in clean clothes and put me in a clean bed. You know, we weren't, obviously kids in the 70s and 80s were washed less than kids now. I mean, that's just general. We were kind of a bit more stinky. But our level, I think we were on a different level.
That, I think that theme just like resonated with me so much, that kind of, I mean, basically everything that you just said, but I'm such a believer that there's this kind of pop psychology thing that you see like on memes or something where people are like, you know, you have to love yourself first and then the love of your life will appear, or whatever the statement is, you know? And, you know, you could make yours be like, you have to clean yourself first and then your clean body will appear. It's like, but like literally if you don't know how to do that, you can't experience that. And it's something that I use in my teaching of just like, because I've experienced this so much in a physical way. I literally took a workshop with this kind of movement, almost kind of a guru person. People are really crazy about him. And it was this 2 or 3 day thing all day. And he's very brilliant. And he would warm us up very specifically. I started to slowly realize these long exercises we were doing were he knew where we were going to get. And one day we had been doing all these things, and then he had us doing one leg squats, which are called pistol squats, where you know you have one leg sticking out and then you just go all the way to the floor and back up on one leg. And I thought, well, I can't do this on my left leg. I was like, I'm pretty sure I can do it on my right leg, but I can't do it on my left leg. And then lo and behold, I just dropped to the floor and come right back up, and I was like, oh my God, he got us here. He warmed us up and really taught me something new about my body. It wasn't a strength issue. It was a connection issue. It was a faith issue, really. I didn't think it was possible, but he created the structure so that I could just fall right into it actually very easily. And that like broke my brain, where I was like, oh my God, if you can't feel it, you don't know it. And once you feel it and you know it, then this whole world opens. Now I suddenly have all this confidence at the end of that workshop, which was like quite a while ago, where I just was like, oh, probably I can do anything if I'm taught correctly. And if somebody leads the way for me, which is very not, I think, in the way a lot of Western people think. I have to do it myself. I have to figure this out. If I can't figure it out, I'm stupid or I'm bad at things or whatever. And that workshop, I was really like, oh, I just need the right guidance, which is also not at all what I had as a child. And then I even was applying that to my personal life of like, if I want to be in a better relationship or I want to have like better connections with people, I need to actually find someone who I can experience that with so that I know where to aim, because it's possible that I can't do this I can't do this on my own. I can't just imagine what having a respectful, close, intimate relationship with anyone, a partner, a friend. I can't imagine what that's like if I've never experienced that. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think I really learned a lot of social possibility, I would say, from literature and good movies and other people writing about or depicting family structures or friendships or partnerships, so that I could recognize that that's a possibility, because it wasn't anything that I was seeing or experiencing in any way. So I'm very grateful. Shout out D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover.
No, but I think that's the whole point, isn't it, of experiential learning? Because that's what you're describing, and that's what I often say to clients and people I work with. I often say, the whole point of therapy is to, in a safe environment, experience something you haven't experienced before, to be somewhere where you can test that out, and then that you can go and repeat that behavior in the rest of your life. And I think experiential learning that you're describing is so important, and that because when you haven't had those models, like for me, like I didn't have that feeling of being clean, or I didn't know what certain to be. There's a bit in the book where I describe like buying I really like French lingerie, and I live in France, and I describe like the just buying myself, like when I arrived in France, and like discovering like lacy underwear, and I'd kind of grown up with this totally utilitarian idea of the body. It was like the body was like a machine. And the first article, an essay I wrote, which led to this being published, was called The Utopian Machine. I'd been commissioned to write for a review, and I called it The Utopian Machine because I was really interested in that idea of like the body as a machine, because like the idea for me as a young woman that I could wear lacy underwear was just like why on earth, and what planet would that ever happen? And I found all my kind of teenage joy in being a punk, because as a punk I could wear loads of makeup, which we weren't allowed to in the community because it was like really utilitarian. But I was also quite hardcore, so it meant that kind of allowed me to have the paradox of being, this sort of toughness that I had, and quite aggressive. And, I went on, I was kind of demonstrating against every single cause. And so, yeah, and the whole, like you say, if you don't have an experience, it's incredibly difficult. People can tell you, can say to you, hey, go, it's like this when you're clean, or it's like this when you're in a safe relationship. But you just don't, it's just impossible. It's like, it's so difficult. Like, it took me years to be somebody. I'm so used to being autonomous. And I've been with my partner for 31 years, and which in itself is totally random. We just got married, actually.
Yeah, I saw that on your Instagram. That was very sweet.
Yeah, after 31 years. And anyway, yeah, so we just got married. But like, he'll say, like, for me to be somebody who could ask for help, it was like, no, it's fine. I'm just dealing with it. Yeah, it's fine. It's like, yeah. And you could see me kind of like completely wired up about something or other. And it was just like, no, I'll deal with it. No, everything's fine.
Yeah.
And because it's so difficult when you don't have that experience. And I think as a child, you're constantly modeling yourself on the environment around you, aren't you? What it provides for you, what it anticipates for you, and it's it is possible to relearn other behaviors, but sadly it's much longer as an adult. I always find that a bit tragic. It's like,
very tragic.
Damn, if you'd have been given like I don't know, just an extra year as a child, and you could have but whereas as an adult, when you want to dismantle that learning, God, it's really long. It's really long.
My partner and I just watched this documentary about immersive learning, so that children become bilingual. These are immersive learning schools, which actually is the way the California school system is, or at least in San Francisco. I don't know if it's a whole state. And it starts with this thing where this like statement that's like, there's a specific age that is the best time to become bilingual. And I turned to my partner and I was like, is it in your 40s? It's like before the age of 13. And I was like, damn it. Like, that is so much how I feel about all the unlearning. You're like, is it now in your 40s? Is that the best time to rewire your brain?
I think it is, actually.
Oh,
I think
good,
40
please.
is quite good. I think that's a really good time, because I think that's a kind of age where you've sort of, there's some certain thing, it obviously depends on your life trajectory, but you know,
Sure.
lots of things have kind of settled, I think, at that point. And I think it's not the sort of retrospective of 50, but it's like a moment where there's still a big remaking that can be, I feel like that's a really, I mean, I think you can do it at any age. I'm like totally...
I do too. It depends how hard you want to work.
Yeah, totally. I just, you know, sometimes people say that to me and I'm just like, no, I'm highly a believer. I really am.
Well, I think curiosity is such a driver for our brains. If you let it, you know, that could be a whole other trauma where you shut that down. But I think I am very grateful to my own curiosity and everybody around me in my life that shares that, because I think that allows your brain to stay flexible and be open to these moments of resonance or inspiration where you're like, oh, this really hit me. Something is kind of unfolding in me, or almost clearing, you know, this is speaking to something that I hadn't articulated yet, and actually being open to that happening. Happens, I think, when you're also older and more mature, and you can kind of sit with that for a minute. There were times where I was reading your book that I was like depressed for like 3 days, or not depressed, but really down, where it was really processing for myself. You were really speaking to things that I had not been able to. You have such a like firm grasp on things that are so subtle to a child's experience. And maybe it is literally this environment, almost like a theater set that you were in, that makes those things more easier to kind of pull out. I just had moments where I was just constantly like, how could I be having such a deep resonance with somebody's story that is so opposite on the outside in terms of how I grew up, but all of these kind of emotional experiences. And I almost have this visual of like your kind of small little child self and all these adults passing through, which is very much my own kind of sense memory of my childhood, which is basically that my parents separated when I was 4.5, and my father's house in particular was he was a well-known fiction author, and kind of definitely in our area, a local celebrity. I mean, within the writing circles, people are very excited about him, but it's not like I sign my name and people immediately recognize it. And our house was always full of people that were real kind of hanger-ons of my dad. My dad did not have good boundaries. Neither of my parents have good boundaries or any boundaries. And so he let our house always just be full of people. And so similarly, there was like not a lot of time when it was just my dad and my sister and I. And also these adults did not care about myself or my sister. They were there for my dad. So there was also this feeling of being missed, being ignored in plain sight, being, you know, I'm somehow in the way by just being here and being a child, doing child things, wanting to talk to people, wanting to play. And it's funny because that is so much my memory of my father's house. But I also know that we had plenty of like school night dinners and things that were, you know, much more quote unquote normal. But there was like, in a way, because that boundary was not there, it did always feel threatened that anyone could come through the door, which literally would happen. People would just show up. He had this long driveway and you would see them approaching, and it was just, people would just stop by all the time. There was never a sense that anyone was kind of protecting that space. And my mom's house always seemed like a real respite, because it was quiet. Like that was the way that I really divided the two houses. My mom's house was quiet. Nobody came there. It was, a very like charming kind of comfortable home, but my mom personally has no boundary. And so I never felt I could really trust her to protect us or protect herself. So that was really stressful for me. And looking back, there are just so many times where, I am just like, I can't believe that you were letting me do this or not do this or whatever. I mean, there was just it was that early 80s parenting. I think I'm about exactly 10 years younger than you are. Of like, letting me lead my own life as a child and a teenager, especially just, why guide your child when you could just let them grow adult themselves with no knowledge or skills?
And it is very interesting, isn't it, in those kind of quite how ritualized children like their lives to be.
Yeah.
And there's something very structured. If you look at like educational models, like kind of Montessori, or I don't know, even all educational models have that kind of sense of like structure and temporality and chronology and small spaces. And I think, there is often, and that's what's complicated, I think, for parents, is there's a side of domestic life which is with children, which can be quite relentless and quite boring. Yeah. And, you have to get them to bed and you have to do their homework and you have to kind of make sure they brush their teeth and that they're clean and there is a kind of drudgery. And we are also, and I think that's an important thing, is that we are in a capitalist kind of model that's separated home life and economic life. So that kind of is less valued as well. I think it's not something we see as being particularly important. You're not kind of recognized for it. You're not, and in itself, it asks kind of a lot of you. And it is very interesting, I think, like what you say about that repetition thing, it made me think of, like, with my work in child psychiatry, all my workshops, my drama therapy workshops, were so structured. Like every workshop had like a kind of beginning, middle and end with the kids, and like a entry space and then different spaces in the room. And they just loved that. And we could just do the same thing endlessly. It's like reading the same bedtime story. Mm-hmm. And I think in those kind of spaces, like what you're describing, your childhood, and that obviously resonates, there's a huge connection there. And it's you get very lost in those spaces as a child when there are not those boundaries, either not the boundary with the parent figure or not the boundary because anyone can turn up and anyone can be there.
Yeah, lost is the way to put it. I think like that is an experience that you describe so well for yourself and your growth into your teen years, when you really have more agency, just because literally you can leave the house, you have friends that are outside the house, where you start to really kind of form yourself a bit more with your own ability to kind of look back on your own unmet needs and stuff. You're still a teenager, so you don't have like all the experience to kind of see what's happening, but you do start to reach out and find these lifelines and in a way form yourself in opposition to what you're experiencing. That's also, like you write so beautifully about kind of teen experience, which I always appreciate, because I think not a lot of people give teens like that moment. It's also such a brief moment in our lives, but it's so precious and so like fertile with so much. And I think we are quick to be like, oh, my punk years, like, oh, but you really like celebrate that and also pull it into your life now and kind of like how your teen years has influenced you now in terms of how you see yourself as a woman and, you know, your expression and with your own children. I guess there's not really a question in there. I appreciated that moment.
No, but it is. I find those. I find teen years fascinating. I work with teenagers for years, and I think that basically it's like you're, you know, coming of age. And I think what happens to you during that time is actually really fundamental, and what the caregivers around you give you is really fundamental. And things like, and just the joyful kind of madness of teenage years and the energy and this kind of sparky and this sparkiness, they're so fiery. And for us, it was obviously very, very complicated for the kids in the commune because we were all in this group which had been totally abandoned and left to ourselves. And then suddenly we all become teenagers and we're in this very strange kind of group where, you know, it can go from like 18 to sort of 8 in the same group, hanging around together all the time. And everyone starts to develop, you know, we get through puberty, people start to fancy each other. And then there's the whole complication of the fact that we've been brought up as brothers and sisters. That's what we've been told. We're all being one happy family. And, you know, and I think that kind of, obviously there's no sense of incest in the way that one can describe it with someone who is from exactly the same family, but that it is a shadow over us. What does it then mean that those relationships are? What is this, the sort of symbolic, like you would in a step family?
Yeah.
You know, like you would in a step family, and it's the precariousness of suddenly being stuck in like that house. And like you say, like I start to go out and I rebel, and then I find this way of rebelling, which is through punk, which is kind of accepted in the commune, but not, because my clothes are like
right
off the scale. Yeah, it's the high point of my fashion. I wish I could dress like that now. I feel like I was so cool. I feel like I was so cool when I was 14. I was like, oh God. Yeah. And yeah, but it's kind of conformist sort of simultaneously, because I really adhered. It was all I ever knew really for so long, that I really adhered to the community for so long and just kind of normalized what had happened there. And then as I, you know, it was only really when I left, and then when I started to have had my own kids, that I was like, that was a bit weird, wasn't it? And it was because, you know, British people, it's, you know, it's very fascinating. It's a stereotype of British culture, but it is the truth. We would avoid the subject. You know, once like my family had left and everything like that, we'd avoid the subject. So I kind of rebelled when I was a teenager, but, you know, I was still, my sister rebelled more because she really, you know, she was actively critical at that age of the house.
Yeah, her trajectory is so interesting because also she went into marketing. Is that correct? So that's, I mean, that really almost made me laugh out loud, that she grew up in this community that was so against capitalism, money, things, you know, all the kind of straight stuff, if you could describe it that way. And then she goes into like the most capitalist, like, you know, I really loved that. I just thought that was like a perfect way to... She seemed to, in a way, because she was more conscious of what was happening, and she also had some very horrible experiences, suffer in some ways more because she was really aware of kind of had more cognizance of how terrible this was while she was experiencing it. I don't know if I'm misreading that. So I thought her story of leaving and going into marketing, and that seemed interesting, a real way to shed that.
Yeah, I mean, she arrived, when we arrived, she was 2 years older than me, and I think she was 8, I was 6. So I think I really was still a small child. She was older. She'd experienced she had a longer experience of life in a kind of, suburban setting, going to school, just us having our house, etc. And so when we arrived there, I think very quickly she was disenchanted and was then much more vocally against, and after the various tragic things that happened to her, but much more vocally against the commune than I was. And I really wanted, I felt so impassioned, and I think I'd been, there's a bit where I describe us being sort of force-fed like foie gras geese. I mean, we really were told so often that we were privileged, that it was very difficult to kind of unhear that. And also throughout our childhood, we were constantly interviewed for TV, for radio, for press. So that also gives you this whole sense of like how you present where it is that you grew up. And I describe like one of the last interviews I did when I was like, I think I must have been 20, and it was a radio interview and I was with her, and she turned around and kind of went, oh, it was completely crap, our upbringing or something. And I remember looking and thinking, oh, God, that was like, I was just like, oh, and I would just kind of, and by the end I was so exhausted of saying to people, oh, it's just like everywhere else. And then realising that it wasn't, but that I didn't know what it was, actually. Yeah. I didn't know what my childhood was. It was like an anomaly to me. It was like a mystery, because I think I'd been so ingrained to have this this form of, it's not quite radicalisation, but enculturation of like, this is what your childhood is, this is what it is, that it was so difficult for me to understand what it was, my childhood. Like,
that was really interesting. So often in the book, you literally quote people basically shouting slogans at you as a child, as you're doing this or that. If you have a question, if you have a problem, if you walk in wearing, an outfit as a teen trying to express yourself, and people just coming right back at you with, things about like female bodily autonomy rights or workers' rights, or, like real political statements all the time. So at such a young age, you're absorbing these things, which ostensibly, like, all of them are, I mean, I'm very liberal. Like, they're all things that I agree with, you know what I mean? There was nothing that was terrible, but also to be told that when you're 7 years old, 10 years old, when you're just trying to, make your lunch or something. And
I think there's a total brutalization. I think it's really brutal. I find it, when when I did the research in the British Library, I went and looked at a lot of the documents that I'd looked at as a child, and it was so shocking to see, rape is legalized marriage, and I remember reading things like that. And then having these like really close pictures of like sort of these, and I understand that for women of that era, obviously seeing a really good pencil drawing of a vagina so that you know the different parts of your anatomy. But like when you're 6 or 7, I think there are sort of gentle ways to bring that about, rather than like looking at these pictures and it was things that you would in the house come across all of a sudden. Like one day I was in the kitchen and I remember this woman like sticking her finger inside a chicken and saying to me like, this is an anus, this is shit, you need to know about this. And you're like there and you're sort of like 6 or 7 thinking, it all looks a bit disgusting and like, and I think this sense of not using euphemisms of, I think there was a sense in that at that point for the adults where they had this huge sense of freedom through all of those things, quite understandably, but then they were then suddenly exposing us to this information which was not at all adapted to our age, because obviously things, I believe very strongly that most things you can talk to kids about, but you talk to the kids about, you can talk to kids about people dying, you can talk to kids about or refer possibly to how sex happens, when they're little, but without actually describing it. There's all sorts of stuff you can talk to kids about. Kids can fall in love, kids can, but they do it as kids. It's like the misinterpretation that happened at that time. And it was a huge thing in the 70s, where there was a confusion between the idea of recognizing that kids had a sexuality and that kids had adult sexuality. Mm-hmm. Which is a hugely dangerous confusion, a hugely dangerous confusion. And the slogans, but all information, like I would read as a kid, The Women's Room. I don't know if you read that.
No.
It's an American book from the 70s, and it's the story of like a group of American housewives who are kind of going mad in domestic life and like being interned in psychiatric units and like baking cookies and having sex with people's husbands at parties. But it was like a kind of Bible of the feminist era. And I first read it when I was like, I don't know, I was about 8 or something, because it was just on the bookshelf. So I took it and I read it because I was reading everything. And I really thought that the world outside was like that. That's what I thought. I thought that women were raped all the time, and obviously women are. That's the kind of complexity. But
that is,
But you have to have the emotional maturity so that message hits you in the right way at the right time. And I think there's an immense amount of danger in giving people or children, how we give children information so that it's not damaging to them.
It, for some reason, is making me think I love hearing stories, and I think like This American Life did a thing at some point, one of their, producers or something, they interviewed them on the show about seeing movies that you weren't old enough to see at a young age. And this story, the man who's like my age, his dad showed him The Shining when he was like 5, because he was like, and literally said, oh, there's kids in it, you'll like it. And then he ended up having nightmares for years. Like it really traumatized him to the point where he just really suffered for nightmares for like 5 years, And similarly, I have much older half siblings who were a chaotic presence in my young life. And one of them showed me Jaws also when I was like 5, which now is one of my favorite movies. It's a brilliant, beautiful, film, if you're just like into film. Absolutely terrified me. And I literally wouldn't take baths I would scream in the bath. And even now, I live at the beach in Brooklyn, and we get to swim anytime we want. And I love the ocean, and I love the beach, and I love sharks. But I definitely swim around. I always tell my partner that I always make sure someone else is between me and the rest of the ocean. And I'm like, they're the bait. They'll get chomped first.
Yeah.
And I know that's just this nugget that's in my head because I didn't literally have the emotional capacity to understand a movie and a story.
The one we would watch, and I described that in Home is Where We Start,
God, yes.
was Harold and Maude. Harold and Maude on repeat. On repeat.
What a random and just wild film to watch as children with no understanding of.
And particularly all of the suicide scenes at the beginning, because there are literally, I don't know, like 10 suicide scenes with Harold like hanging himself, doing a kamikaze knife, like in the bath, slitting his wrists. I mean, they're quite graphic, aren't they? Because he stages all of those things. And it's sort of simultaneously this really beautiful film to me, and now I find it really difficult, actually, certain things like that from my childhood to sort of rewatch, because I just feel this sense of real sadness, actually, sometimes, of why on earth was I watching that? And you know, and that's, I think those things they're quite difficult. Like it's in itself, it's a beautiful film, but it's like,
right,
that why was I watching this like on repeat, so that like I knew all the words off by heart, like I must have literally watched it hundreds of times, those kind of big questions that come up are difficult.
And I think, to tie what you were saying about people kind of throwing information at you without any softness, it teaches you to really swallow big concepts, like literally swallowing something that's like a giant hunk of bread and just like get it down your throat. Like I think as a young child, if you're getting exposed to these things with no care on it, and like I said earlier, like no teacher who's creating the structure for you to experience something, to actually process it, to understand it more deeply, you learn this skill to just kind of take in this information and just put it somewhere, somehow make sense of it. And I feel like just because I was always exposed to adults than strangers basically as a child, and I would overhear things, or they would tell things to me, or I would, you know, see adult men having shouting matches about politics or some kind of personal thing, and I don't know how to deal with that. I can only take that in and like, you know, make of it whatever I did. But I think that was when in your book where I so often was just like sad for 3 days, feeling that same thing of just like, how could I have experienced these things? Especially that now I have a good friend who has actually like every catalyst moment in my life where I was like, I think I should revisit this in therapy or something, has been by being around children who were the age that I was during much of that period of my life, and really seeing their childlike spirit that's being protected by their parents and their communities, and going, oh, I was really different at 5. I was really different at 7. And just this summer, this friend of mine who has a toddler came to visit and stayed with us for almost a week. And I'm hanging around with his daughter, who's delightful, and she's just 4. And she's very curious, and she asks questions about everything. And we talked about all kinds of things. Dogs in the past that I've had that died, you know, she just had all kinds of big questions. But it seemed to me impossible. Like, what a transgression, what a harm, like literally a violence, if I was like, things die and they're in the ground. Like, I was like, I could never even bring myself, you know, and it wasn't like I sugarcoated things either, but basically I have dogs, and her father, we all had dogs together. Actually, her father is my ex, and we're still friends, so that's why our backstory is so linked. But she was asking about his dogs because I have dogs now. She knows about them, and she's always curious. She always says, and they're dead now. And so in my garden, my old dogs are buried there. And so I was telling her that and telling her about his dogs. And I was like, we didn't sugarcoat anything, but God, I could never even imagine making that harsh in any way, kind of forcing it on her. This is all to say also, do you have an empathy for those adults, or like an understanding of why they would do that? Because I also don't feel like really a rage, but it is a real sense of despair of like, I don't understand how they could have seen my little 5-year-old face and said those things or exposed me to those things they must have noticed the effect.
I think that the boomer generation were breaking so many molds as well, that I think they had this sense of that there was the whole kind of, you know, and it is a bit of a fallacy, isn't it? The kind of whole like free speech, as though everything can be said, whereas that in itself just, you know, of course things can be said, but it's all about how you say them. It's not, there's no such thing as just kind of neutral information, I don't think. And I think so they were kind of doing all this kind of boundary breaking for themselves, a lot of the adults that I was growing up with. And I think in that sense, I do have kind of empathy for them, in the sense that they'd grown up, some of them would have been to boarding school, they'd have grown up with this really rigid, and I think a lot of the women with a lot of kind of repression in their sort of physicality, and therefore suddenly being able to like, you know, really encouraging, like I grew up in an environment where lots of women were home birthing and they were breastfeeding. And so there's kind of very positive sides to that, which I think kind of influenced me. And then like that information thing. And then I think, you know, there is in that kind of consciousness raising, there can be a whole kind of quite self-indulgent thing as well. And like I was saying earlier, children and domestic life it's not as exciting as consciousness raising. And I think when you have a little kid in front of you, it's almost as well, I think there was in the utopian commune I was in, there was very much this sense of we were privileged, and we were going to be privileged because we were going to hear the truth.
Right.
And there's this Lacanian term about the real. And Lacan says the real is a tunnel that like has no end. It's like, and I think there's almost this idea, I really had this feeling all throughout my childhood when I look back of like, it's a bit like the endlessly opening doors. It's like all the information can be given to you, all the films you can watch, this kind of place without boundaries. And I think that goes with the information. And there's this almost fake idea that somehow as kids we were being conscious raised or enlightened or were privileged to be talked to like that, and then became quite kind of precocious. Like I think I was quite a precocious child. Yeah, quite like you know, had something kind of snappy to say.
In my mind, I loved hanging out with adults, but looking back on that, I don't know that I really did, but I loved chatting and being funny and entertaining and being smart.
Yeah, because you're like this little, I feel like I was like a little performing monkey sometimes. You're kind of there and they're telling you these stories, and then you're kind of, you know, using everybody's first name, and then you're telling the stories about, you know, the gossip, and using this kind of radical vocabulary and saying, yeah, everything should be equal and we should have a free society, and you're like 7 and they're all going, wow, you know, and there's again, I think that sadness when you look back on those moments, because you're kind of incarnating something that has nothing to do with you actually. It really has nothing to do with you. You're kind of part of somebody else's fantasy, a kind of projection, I think, of what almost they wish they wanted to have.
100,000%.
I think
really
there's
like a pantomime, like it's which children are so good at doing that.
It's so performative. It's you know, you're in this kind of false Winnicott false self thing, and you're kind of people pleasing, and you're adapting to the environment, and you're, you know, you've got these kind of little bright eyes, and you're articulate and funny and yet quite sad inside. And I think it's that sadness that I think you then connect with as an adult. I think when you look back, you look at the kind of performing monkey, and then you sort of see your sadness, I think. And there's a line where I say that in Home is Where We Start, and where I sort of said that a child's sadness is very ordinary and like a pebble, but it contains the secrets of the world. And I feel like children's sadness should really be taken seriously, actually. And you know, to sort of like that those moments of like gentleness and kindness and adapting to children are just so fundamental to their well-being.
Yeah, I mean 1,000 times. What group therapy class of yours can I join? I think part of what you do also, which I think was so beautiful for me to read, is that you give so much respect to the child, and I think really gave words to so many experiences, like internal experiences that I had. And even just hearing you say that, it's like the child is so intuitive, and I think that's like the double-edged sword for the child's psyche or experience, is that they make decisions or kind of, create actions just in a lightning flash because they are so good at, they're existing in such a experiential way that sensing things from different adults or cues from the environment, they immediately shift. It's happening so fast. Whereas an adult, you have experience, you have different kind of confidence in yourself, you have different physical boundaries. Also, as a child, you really have no boundaries. You don't know that you can have boundaries. You don't know that you can leave a room that's uncomfortable. As an adult, hopefully, and plenty of adults struggle with this, we all struggle with this to some degree, you realize you can literally go, you know what, I'm not having fun here and I'm going to leave. Or like, this person is really rude, I actually don't need to engage with them. But as a child, you're just trying to figure out, like, what do I do? How do I kind of get through this next moment? And that was so powerful just to kind of really have that written about, both from your eyes as a child and then from your eyes as an adult, quoting all of these sociologists and your experience as a therapist. And that was amazing.
Yeah, I really wanted it to have that narrative sense when I was writing Home is Where We Start. I wanted it to have that kind of narrative sense of really being inside the child's body, and that feeling of being inside the body and the feeling of being inside a teenager. And I think as a writer, I'm quite lucky when I'm writing fictional character. I also write novels, and if I'm writing kind of fictional children characters, I have a really, really good memory. So I actually remember from when I was 2 or 3, like I have almost photographic memory. But I wanted to have that contrast between those very intimate moments, like you say, where you don't know whether you can leave a room, you don't know you can have boundaries. You're just sort of absorbing a lot of things when you're a child, and then just have this adult looking back and saying, but what was the impact? So if those were the intentions and those were the feelings, what actually was the impact? What does it mean not to have doors? What does it mean to break down the nuclear family and for you to be able to wander around a house? What does it mean growing up with a gang of teenagers? What does it mean if you don't actually have any time with a parental figure? And that adult voice really allows to ask a lot of the bigger questions, so that it's a micro and a macro story, which I think, like you say, you've related to it, but like so many people from different backgrounds have related to it in the different angles where they've kind of come into it, which is wonderful for me.
Can you also, just because I feel like I learned so much about communes. Can you also just clarify for people the difference between a cult and a commune? Because even when I read the Guardian excerpt, I will say your book is gripping in that because it's so specific, the environment, you can read it almost with the way someone reads true crime or something. Like, I definitely was reading it with like, oh my God, all these characters, what's going to happen? There's kind of darkness lurking everywhere. But then I also, as I was learning, I was like, okay, it's not a cult. Like, there's not going to be some weird ritual at some point. But people could be confused.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's a really important. So when you go into a sect, there are obviously crossovers between a commune and a sect. But just like there's crossovers between a gated community, if you live in one, and a sect, any kind of closed environment, a nunnery, a monastery, all of those kind of things will have things in common. But in a sect, there are specific steps where you go in and also specific steps when you go out. And you have a subserviency to a leader. And there are specific things in terms of what happens to your own personal wealth. Like, it's defined and it is completely different. It is. But there are crossovers. So, for example, the withdrawing from the society is a similar thing. The use of specific language is a similar thing. A different social and domestic organisation is similar. But no one was threatening us. If we wanted to leave, we could have walked out the door. Whereas you can't in a sect. You absolutely cannot leave a sect. And you owe certain things to the leader. Our leaders actually changed. They were charismatic revolutionary leaders, which are very different They operate. They have their own psychological pattern. So Alfredo, in the book, has his own pattern as an initial leader, and then other leaders take over. But it's not the same as a leader in a sect. Like, the leader in a sect is always the same leader.
I have two more questions for you. I know we've been talking for a while. One is really, you were touching on earlier that as the children became teenagers, this is really kind of like a kind of a crux moment in the book. The children become now this kind of gang of almost adults, and they've had their own evolution because they have been left to their own devices. So there's a scene in the kitchen where there's actual physical violence between one of the adults and your sister and another teenager. And essentially it's like it is that the children become an impediment to this environment that the adults are trying to create. It seems at some point they start to say there's too many kids, and then when the teenagers all move out, the rules change and there are less children allowed. Can you speak to that just in terms of a community that's intentional? There was similar to what we were talking about earlier with like this interior world or the world that was happening there. And then when you guys would go to school, there was this interesting through line of the intentionality and the ideas and the beliefs that were happening, and then what was actually happening. And these children are going to grow up and they are now like the same height as the adults, and they have needs and they're sexual and all this stuff, and no one has created any place for that.
No, I think there was a complete sort of, so we all grew up, and then all of a sudden, I think if you imagine, and if you are around teenagers, you know, teenagers will walk into a room, they have a very specific energy. If there's a number of teenagers, you know, it is a life kind of a moment where that you kind of walk as a pack. You know, there's quite a lot of confrontation, not with all teenagers, it happens differently to teenagers in different ways. But there was, you know, like 15 of us, 20 of us in teenagedom. So, and also you would go down. So like, I remember the first time going into the dining room wearing makeup. So, you know, rather than just facing, you know, your like small 3 or 4 parental figures or siblings, you had like, you know, 40 people looking you up and down with your like really badly applied makeup and kind of trying to dress up close. So I think initially that there's that. I think there's this huge sense then of this huge need of intimacy that you have as a teenager. You suddenly couldn't have it. And then this pack was so huge and there was no recognition. There was no sense of us, the dangers that we were, you know, potentially having to face. And I describe in the book a sexual aggression. And then all of a sudden, at a certain moment, I think the adults began to realise there was stuff going on, and they suddenly banned us from certain behaviour. So they ban, there's an actual ban.
Yeah.
Whereas there are no rules about anything, and suddenly they actually call it that. They call it a ban. They're banning mixed sleeping. And at that point, it makes so little sense to any of us, because we've been brought up that we're like autonomous. We're part of the gang of the kids, but we're autonomous. So I remember my total outrage at it, because it didn't make any sense whatsoever. Like, we weren't in a safe environment. I think all of it had already happened. It was kind of like been there, you know, got the t-shirt, seen the film, kind of made the film, starred in the film. It was like, and what was, and I describe this in The Home Is Where We Start, when I go back to the community years later and I meet this woman, and this woman says to me, oh, you were here at the time with all the kids. And a really nice woman, lovely woman, but her face kind of dropped and like, oh, they never let that happen again. And I was like, oh my God, like they actually, you know, it's kind of been in the history of this place, and they let that happen to us, you know, and almost it was seen, like you say, we were the impediment. We were the ones that somehow had run wild. And I remember as a teenager this terrible sense of like, yeah, kind of guilt. Like,
I was going to say, yeah.
Just a sense of guilt, because they would, you know, they'd look at us and they'd go, you know, the kids are out of control. And they just look at us and just this feeling constantly of kind of that we'd let them down, from this kind of, we were the kid gods, we were going to be these radical free beings. And then and that chapter in the book is called Where the Wild Things Are, because it's all about being monsters. And what does it mean when you feel like you're a monster? Because I think as teenagers you feel like you're a monster. I think as I know I felt very clearly like something quite, you know, there was too many monstrous things going on. I felt like to the outside world, I was like a freak. And then within the community, I also felt like then we were like these kind of really horrible people. And just not having a place. And the only place of feeling at home was then in, you know, I started to get into the Rocky Horror Picture Show and things like that, because then you've got this absolutely brilliant vision of monsters, which have got loads of agency and are the coolest people in the film. But yeah, it's that period is so specific, and like we were saying earlier, I feel like just teenagerdom is just such a rich resource. But they'd planted the seeds, you know, that's how we ended up there. It was entirely the responsibility of the social structure within which we'd grown up.
And it almost feels like an admission of guilt when they start putting these bans. They literally are reverting to this, like, you know, what they feel is an outdated, like, gauche way of life, to have a hierarchy with the parents overseeing the children, and all of a sudden they try to enforce this thing that they've been in opposition, and it feels almost like an admission of guilt that they realize that there's no control, and that this has happened, and that they need to impose something. And at the same time, I could totally imagine this kind of confusion and guilt, like, we're doing something wrong, but I don't know what else to do. There's no other way to be, and now I'm kind of ostracized or being punished for essentially what I've created on my own, which is also so painful.
But I don't think it didn't feel like an admission of guilt from their side, because I don't think we were aware at that point that why had we ended up there in this very chaotic kind of gang. I don't think it didn't feel like an admission of guilt. It just felt very incomprehensible. Yeah, totally incomprehensible. It didn't feel. I think often there's a moment with teenagers where it's incomprehensible and then it feels reassuring. You know, like you really want to go to the party, you really want to go to the dangerous place, you really, really want to do it, and you push and you push and you push, and your parents say to you, no, you really can't do that. And you're sort of like, there's almost a sense of relief. Sure. Because, okay, I don't have to go that far at this age, kind of thing. Yeah. Whereas we'd already kind of gone that far.
You've gone beyond.
So at that point, it didn't really make any sense at all. It was just like putting a plaster on something. It didn't, you know, the cut was too deep. So it didn't make sense to us.
Did your mother, when she left, do you feel like did she get any lasting benefit? Does she have strong connections from there? Did that, like, do you have a sense of kind of her story based on how she moved on?
I think she had parts of it where she felt very like, yeah, she's still got connections with people. And I think there's part of it which, like we were saying, from that moment of arrival, that I think she has really positive memories. And then I think there's a moment where she, in herself, I talked to her about it when she read the book. She said there was a moment where then suddenly she knew that it wasn't a good place, but then didn't quite know how to leave, etc.
Sure.
But I think she does have positive memories.
And when you left, it's kind of also similar to Alex. You both met partners kind of in college and kind of amazingly settled down, which really you would imagine, as I said to Alex, that you would have a whole string of relationships, and with all this chaos that you grew up in, how that kind of your trajectory to creating your own home, and then also beginning to look back, you said really when you had your own children, I'm interested how you even got into therapy and working with children. Did that happen because you started to think about your own childhood, or was it something you were kind of intuitively drawn to?
No, it was totally intuitively, 100%. And the same thing about having a really, long partner. Again, and my partner, we couldn't be from more different backgrounds, which is just so funny because, he's from a Jewish, suburban, really close-knit family. And I counterbalance that in the book to talk about the forms of kind of oppressiveness and what can be difficult in that type of environment. But no, going into therapy was something I was just drawn to. I love all forms of... I trained as an actress, and I very quickly was fascinated by all forms of nonverbal communication. And so I began working with children on the autistic spectrum and just absolutely loved it. And then have spent, alongside my writing, I've spent a big part of my life and still have a huge amount of pleasure working in hospitals and working with people as an arts therapist. And I think what I find really fascinating about working with art with people, I think on a kind of political and a therapeutic level, is that it's very much you're with groups, but you're doing something which is allowing people very much to express their own story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's so specific to art. I think there's something in art where we address the universal and then we address the singular. And it's just one of the things I just love most about my job is the just extraordinary stories that people have with art and the things that they do with art. I love what I do.
It comes across, and all those sections are just as fascinating as everything else. So that was something I particularly enjoyed. The education you really do for the reader alongside these personal experiences that you had, I thought that was very well done. There are lots of kind of memoir that sometimes mix in something academic, but it really flowed so well. Yeah, those aspects. I mean, I love learning things and I love the healing world and things like that. So I particularly enjoyed that, but I thought it was really well done, and then just kind of so beautifully highlighted all of your experiences so that we really had this context that was different than just reading it like a fable or something.
Yeah, I wanted them to be in there, and I think almost as a counterbalance as well, and as a maybe more, like we were saying at the beginning of the conversation, a more experiential way of getting into kind of different environments and different, what does embodied trauma mean? What does a space which structures time mean? How do teenagers deal with trauma? When I worked in child psychiatry with very young children, what were we doing that was, say, different to the environment that I grew up with? So it was like a kind of counterbalance narrative, but one that was less theoretical and more in a story of the, obviously anonymized and blended, but settings of the work I do.
Well, it's really beautiful. Is there anything else that you want to add that we didn't touch on?
Don't think so. It's been great. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think I could just carry on. I think we should go and have tea, or go and have a glass of wine, or, I don't know.
I would love that. I'm gonna I do go to France fairly regularly, so I was like,
yeah,
do. We could meet
come
up.
Yeah, definitely. Seriously, come. I'm about 2.5 hours from Paris. Come and have dinner.
I would love it. Well,
the door is open to my home. Home is where we start. You're very welcome. And my partner's a great cook. And I'm quite good, but he's very excellent if you're a foodie.
I am.
Okay, well, there you go. Set a date.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That was Busybody Podcast. I'm the founder and owner of Brooklyn Strength Studios. You can find me on Instagram at Brooklyn Strength. You can find out more about my offerings on my website, brooklynstrength.com. I hope you'll subscribe to my Substack after class. All's in the show notes. Please rate, review, and subscribe. Please share with your friends so that more people listen to this podcast. I love these conversations, and I hope more people can hear them. My music is by Robert Bryn, performed by the Wild Yaks. My podcast is produced by Brad at Soundtrain Studios, and my illustrations are by Jackie Mendez and Azul Trejo, and edited by myself. Thank you so much.